Hey everyone, Justin here. Before we start today's episode, I have a bit of confession. I made a mistake. I had the wrong settings on the microphone for this episode, and so I don't actually have the nice microphone for what you're about to listen to. I hope that's not too distracting. Please do give me some grace. Hopefully this is the only time this season that we actually end up making this mistake. But that being said, still want to share today's episode because it's a good conversation and one that I think is worth focusing on. So without any further ado, here we go. Welcome back to The Move. We're vibing through the book 10 minutes at a time. I'm your host, Justin Koo, and in today's episode, we're talking about that one time in the Bible where 7 skinny cows become cannibals. If you're wondering what we're looking at, Genesis chapter 41, verses 1 through 36. My guest today is Pastor Harold. Pastor Harold, I feel like out of all the stories that you and I have got to talk about, let's say in the last half dozen or so episodes that you and I co-hosted together, 7 cannibalistic cows is actually one of the easier and more vanilla stories of the Bible. I feel like every single story that you and I have covered has been like R-rated if it were to be visually portrayed. And, this is maybe, you don't want to take a kid to a movie where 7 cows eat 7 other cows. Maybe that's not the best look. But this is, at least there's no sexual deviancy in this specific episode. So that's good news. How did this verse hit you given the general trajectory of everything we've talked about up to this point?
You and me, definitely. It was like, so... This is okay. So there's no nudity, there's no weirdness, there's no there's no onanism, nothing. No, this is this is just a very it was a very vanilla text, like you said, but still meaningful and beautiful. Even though it wasn't scandalous, it still has a scandal of grace. Hey. No, it's a good text. I really enjoyed it. It's a good story. It's one of the and it was interesting revisiting it, just seeing how this is sort of Joseph's story coming to full circle now. A lot of the narrative of Joseph is going to be full circle. The circle is complete, Obi-Wan. So in this case, I know. In this case, so I'll ask you a question. What got Joseph into the pit in the first place?
What got Joseph into the pit? Perhaps
so many options.
Kind of like arrogant way he carried the promise of God is what I would say.
Yes, there's that. There's a little arrogance, but I'm gonna go with dreams.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
Dreams are kind of what got him into he carried the promise of God, but he got these dreams and then he shared them. Yes, probably with a little too much naivete, innocence, arrogance, whatever you want to call it, right? And I was listening to the past episode of Jonathan where he comments on this commentary that calls Joseph the dream master, right? Which is what they, ironically, his brothers are calling him when he shows up to the pit, yada, yada, yada. So what has gotten him into this dilemma is dreams. So from the dreams, he gets into the pit, then he goes into jail. And you left a story where, the cupbearer leaves and it literally says, and he forgot about Joseph, right? And it's like, if you have never read this story and if you're just following the narrative of this man, you're like, dude, will this guy ever catch a break?
Right.
Right? Like this poor guy, listen, I think he's learned his lessons, but will he ever catch a break? And then boom, narrative comes into play. And what is happening? Dreams, right?
It's interesting the way the narrative jumps past the first couple of words, which mine are 2 full years later. You got the whole SpongeBob thing that happens. And yes, I hear what you're saying. Like, he gets forgotten. And then now, here's this great moment where he's not forgotten. But for Joseph, it's been 2 years. That sucks. But you're right. He's into this moment. It's his moment to shine. Pharaoh finally has this dilemma of what do these dreams mean? And this guy finally it clicks in his mind. Like, oh, yeah, there's a guy that I know who should be able to do this. And I love the way that Joseph kind of responds to this idea. Like, Pharaoh's like, hey, so from what I hear, you're the guy. Like, you're the guy who's got the wisdom. You're the guy who can interpret these dreams. Like, you're the guy who's going to solve my problem. And Joseph is like, nah, that's not me.
Right.
I can't. But it is God who could. And I think that's so cool. Just I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe this is a reflection of all the movies that I've seen about the life of Joseph. But it seems like if the original dreams were carried in a certain level of arrogance or confidence, let's say, that was off-putting, Joseph now carries this with still confidence, but with humility now.
Yeah. And something to note that there's a commentary that mentions how in certain rabbinic interpretations that the cupbearer is doing this out of a certain like obligation, but he's not necessarily like, oh yeah, this guy. He's like, yeah, this guy, because he doesn't. Yeah, and it's interesting that if that's the case or not, it's a rabbinical interpretation. But interesting that when you read the text, that it says that there's no recommendation of the cupbearer saying you should bring him. It's just the cupbearer is sharing. He's saying, hey, there was this guy in prison that like told me his dreams. Like told me my dreams. That's it, right? There's no like, you should bring him. And also, if you notice, again, dreams being how the wheel of fortune has now turned in Joseph's favor, right? So now dreams got him into a pit, and now dreams are going to get him out of jail because the dreams of the Pharaoh, which are super weird, are going to be interpreted, and he is going to be confident to say, no, not me, but God, which is already establishing a polemic that you and I are going to follow throughout the rest of the story of the Old Testament, because this is, for Adventists, this is a very easy one, right? For Seventh-day Adventists, the community of faith that you and I belong to, where have you seen this play out also? You've seen it play out in Daniel. Daniel shows up. It's immediately shows up, right? Daniel shows up, and he is called and beckoned, right, by the king, because his magicians can't interpret a dream. And so, interestingly enough, here, the Pharaoh is trying to get this thing solved, and whatever interpretation they're giving him doesn't make sense in his mind. Whereas in Nebuchadnezzar's case, he's like, tell me the dream and its interpretation. And they're all like, we can't do it. And then Nebuchadnezzar is going to kill everybody. Like, definitely different guys, right? You've also seen this play out. You will see it play out later in the story, later in the story, just a few chapters later, books later, but like 400 years later, with Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh's magicians. This polemic between God and deities, between what God's servants can do and what the king's magicians can't. This polemic is already being established. You already are going to follow it also in Balaam, when he tries to trick and curse the people of his. Yep. And he can't. Yes. Like every time there's this polemic between God and the other deities, or God and the king's magicians, and they cannot reproduce what God is doing. So, and it's very specific as to how the servants of God show up and say, this is not in us. Like, we're not the ones giving you the interpretation, but there is a God in heaven who knows the mysteries, who reveals the mysteries. There's a God in heaven who can interpret the dream, and he will tell me what this dream means, and I will share it with you. So what got him into problems now is going to get him out of problems. So his dream was one thing, and now, it gets him out into the open at least.
It's interesting because in some of those stories that you just mentioned, like with Elijah, it very much feels like it's a showdown. It's a war that's taking place with Moses versus Pharaoh. It's very much of like, here's the bad person, here's the good person, and God is like taking a side, and they're fighting. In this story, I don't quite get that sense. In fact, the way that it seems like Joseph is describing what's taking place, Joseph, maybe this is just humility, maybe this is graciousness, or maybe he's actually giving an insight to kind of how God is interacting with Egypt at this moment, because he's like, God is revealing things to you. And it got me to think of Amos chapter 3, where it talks about how surely the Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. And yes, obviously there's a key function that Joseph is playing in interpreting these things, but Joseph is positioning Pharaoh as someone who's having direct access to Yahweh, which makes sense, because we saw this with the previous Pharaoh earlier in the story with Abraham. We see this in other stories where God is like actually communicating with these non-Christian, obviously, and non-Jewish individuals. Like they're just God is relating to them, and it seems like Joseph is positioning Pharaoh on the side of God in this moment.
Right, and the same thing, incidentally, in in Moses, Aaron, and Pharaoh, or Balaam and Israel, you're right. There's a fighting element, right? But in the case of Daniel, which is the immediate place where you go, again, it's
Right.
Daniel who tells Nebuchadnezzar, "Hey, God is showing you what the future holds." It has never been
Yeah.
like God is against you. It's always like God is showing you what the future holds. God is revealing to you what the future holds. So in this case,
passage,
go ahead.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
the same thing.
Sorry,
Yeah.
this passage doesn't have like a conclusion yet, and maybe we'll see that in future chapters. But
Mhm.
minimally, if there's the parallel, we get to see how Nebuchadnezzar responds to all this, and that in the end, there's a certain level
yeah.
of faith or confidence that we can have that Nebuchadnezzar kind of closes the story of his life having faith in Yahweh, and maybe this is one way that Pharaoh responds in kind, because he's putting trust. You'll see in the next episode, putting trust in Joseph and actually responding favorably to the revelation that God gives him.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100% on that. Also, is that which oddly enough, kind of sets up how. That's the other thing that the text kind of pulled out, and that I followed from the narrative, is how clothing is also an element of the full circle in confidence. So he gets his clothing again is an element that gets him into the pit. Like the man, oh, this kid, he shows up wearing the tunic that got him into this problem, right? Which gets torn and sends him to jail, right? It sends him to slavery in Egypt. Then while he's a slave in Egypt, Potiphar's wife takes what from Joseph? Takes his tunic away. So he goes to jail. And now when gets him in trouble. And now when he gets out of jail, he is clothed once again to be in the presence of the Pharaoh. And then, spoiler alert, he's going to get clothed again. He's going to be given something again to be in the status that he is going to have later on in the story.
Wow.
So it's almost like this entire narrative is just focusing on, once again, clothing, which we could like easily do the low hanging fruit of clothing you in the righteousness of Jesus. But why would we do that, right? Because that's not necessarily what the narrative is talking about, but it's just showing this interesting full circle, once again, of clothing, of dressing, of like what it is. So you're right. He is now going to be placed in a position of power. You'll talk about that in the next tomorrow, yes. What happens, because ultimately he is giving Pharaoh advice. He's interpreting the dream. And in the interpretation of the dream, he gives advice. It's almost, again, with humility. You read that in the narrative. It's not like he's I got a solution for you. He's like, if I could share a solution with you, Your Majesty, you should store up the abundance and keep it.
And I think what's interesting is the way that he gives the advice in 33. He's like, hey, Pharaoh, you should find, and this is the NLT, an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge. He's not like, okay, here, you can trust me, right, Pharaoh? Like, you realize that I just gave you this interpretation and yada, yada, yada. Like, he doesn't vouch for himself. Like, there's almost maybe even an implicit, like, he's assuming that after he does this interaction,
he's just going to go back. Yeah.
Back to the pit.
Yeah.
Back to the prison.
Right.
That's so interesting.
Right.
But how he doesn't strategize. He doesn't navigate to position himself in positions of influence.
Come on now. Hello.
Like, I think about Abimelech in previous stories of how he's like, oh, yo, hey, I see that God's with you. Let's make a treaty. Let's make a deal. Like, let's be allies. So that way, we're going to be okay. Like we see the...
Or Laban. Laban.
Or was it both? Yeah. And so it's just so interesting how there's almost like a resignation over this chapter, in the sense that, like, Joseph doesn't seem to be stressed out about his lot in life.
Yeah.
Even while he's in prison. He's just resigned to the fact that God's with me. God's prospering me. Even if I'm in prison, like, it's cool. It's okay.
I wonder if the word, I don't know if the word resignation comes into my mind, but more like the word confidence. He's like, he's confident. He's trusting that, something is going to pan out. And he is definitely, man, I love how you're bringing up the word strategery, because we've heard that a lot used in the move this season. Strategery. strategizing, because we've been seeing it from his great granddaddy, from his granddaddy, from his other granddaddy. We've seen it from his own daddy. And everybody in his life, this man's life, has been like forerunners of strategery. Let's do this in order to get that. Let's go here so we can get that. Let's not say this so that we don't get that. And here Joseph is like, hey, I can't do it, but there's a God who can. Let me give you the interpretation. You should store up stuff so when the skinny years come, you'll have enough to feed your people. And you should find somebody to actually run that project for you instead of you doing it. Find somebody. So that's it. Thank you for your time. And, good luck. So I'll be.
If you need me, I'll be in prison number B.
I'll show myself out. Is that okay with you? I'll just show myself out. And then, well, we can't talk about that because, we'll ruin somebody's show tomorrow. But it's going to change. It's like, exactly. And if you're following the narrative again, if you've never read the story before and you're reading it for the first time, you're like, this guy, he's actually smart. He's actually intelligent. He's actually giving not just the interpretation, but the advice of God to Pharaoh, which kind of talks about how God will sometimes, perhaps even like another low-hanging fruit, exceed what you ask for. Because Pharaoh wasn't asking for advice. He just needed a dream's interpretation. And here's Joseph saying, oh, God is telling you this, and let me add to that this other thing that is super useful to you right now. And I love that. Yeah.
So this isn't a question we've asked a lot this season, or at least not in these words. We've asked it a lot, but just not in this explicit words. But what do you, in this story, what do you feel like this story reveals to us about God?
About Jesus?
This is something that I'm trying to, about Jesus, about Yahweh, about whatever. This is something that I'm trying to do more and more as I'm reading through the text. I'm trying to resist the impulse to be like, if I was Joseph, or since I'm Joseph now, I'm resisting that impulse, right? Because the Bible's not about me.
It ain't about you, man.
On the episode that actually aired this morning, it was funny because someone actually commented on the YouTube comments, which I read every one of your comments, guys.
Oh, okay.
Saying that, I remember watching that Matt Chandler clip. It was awesome, yada, yada, yada. I'm trying to build that into my practice of reading scriptures. Like, okay, stop trying to be David. Stop trying to be Joseph, right? And just, what does the text reveal to me about God?
I think that God, once again, it shows God's, and yet we've seen this before. I think Jonathan or Kessia Rain, I can't remember who's talked about how Joseph is going to be a type of Christ in some previous episodes. So go back and check that out. But first of all, how Joseph's is going to be a type of Christ, I think we're going to see later on in the story, like in the specificity of the reconciliation of the siblings. Relationship that is torn. Like, I mean, talk about a broken relationship, dude. Seriously,
so right? Slavery is kind of a big deal.
You did what, and the opportunity that I get for vengeance, but we're not going to go into that right now. I think that here it is showing once again how God operates and moves within history and within anything that happens. Because you could easily take the theme of Joseph and take it into the tagline, what you intended for evil got turned into good, right? Yeah. Because just like we saw the full circle take around and for dreams that God gave him, got him out of, this is once again God operating within what got him into trouble and saying, I'm going to work through this. I'm going to work by this. I'm going to work in this because that's the type of God that I am. It's also it's a very open God that is willing to talk to Pharaoh, to talk to anybody. Yeah. That is, and that's a paradigm that sometimes it's not just a Christian, or I'll speak to the specificity of our community of faith, Seventh-day Adventism. All right. Seventh-day Adventism, sometimes we have this propensity of living a life assuming that God only talks to us. Yeah. Right. And that God doesn't talk to anybody else. And that, in fact, we are the ones that are tasked to, by the way we live our lives, by our diet, our dress, or whatever external codes of conduct that we should observe that are good, that we will be able to reveal God to these pagan people who don't know better. And it turns out that as you look at the scriptures, it seems that God hasn't placed all his eggs in the Seventh-day Adventist basket.
Sure.
Like, okay, it's like, it's not that God is limited only through us. Thank God that the rocks can cry out. All right. So the rocks can cry out, my man. Like, listen, if you think that you are like, you're the only vessel of communication that I have to a world that needs to hear about me, yeah, get that out of your head real quick. And the other thing that I see here of God, like right off the top of my head, is how he and I said it before, is that how he moves in history, and how even when you might not see, he's still working, you know. He's still operating. Like in those 2 years of silence between the interpretation of the cupbearer and the panadero, oh man, baker, sorry, the cupbearer and the baker, there's 2 years that go by. If you could put yourself in that time frame and wonder, man, what happens, right? Like, what's going on? And resisting the temptation of like, oh, you might be in a season of waiting right now, you know? But it's 2 years. You don't know what happens 2 years. And sometimes you might be wondering, Joseph was, I would love to know if, when I see Joseph, I'd like to know, like, what was going through your head over those 2 years?
If you paid attention to the animated film, he was planting a tree.
Yes. You know better than I.
That's a banger. That's such a good song.
So he composed a song in the 2 years that he was waiting for there you go. Time well spent. So I think that is definitely what we see God doing here, is God's just God's overall, what you would call it, his working in history, through history, and through all the, I think that's called God's transcendence. If I'm not mistaken, it's a nice theological term. I could be wrong. So if I get it wrong, I'm sorry. But it's just God's. Yeah, take my degree away. You know, I'll be defrocked. But it's the transcendence of God that works through history and that works through the events of history. That I sometimes we get the temptation of saying, oh, you know, destiny and predestination. God's just working through those events, and he's doing what he's going to do, which is, at this point, as we've seen in the move, I'm going to save humanity, and I'm going to do it through a family that, yes, is messed up, but I am going to do it. Why? Because I am faithful. That's it. And you get to see how we get to see how it plays out.